What if I told you that in medieval Europe, a man could get into more trouble for masturbating alone than for visiting a brothel? Or that married couples were technically allowed to have sex on only about half the days of the year? Welcome to the strange, contradictory world of medieval sex. Today we're looking at what people actually did behind closed doors, what the church said they were allowed to do, and how wide the gap was between the two. This is one of history's most misunderstood topics, and the truth is far stranger than the myths. The Middle Ages stretch roughly from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to around 1500, almost 1,000 years across an entire continent. So there's no single medieval attitude towards sex, but one institution touched nearly every corner of life and tried with mixed success to control what happened in the bedroom: the Catholic Church. According to medieval theology, sex existed for exactly one approved purpose: making babies within marriage. Anything outside that lane, sex before marriage, sex purely for pleasure, certain positions deemed unnatural, was sinful to some degree. Canon lawyers and theologians debated endlessly which acts crossed the line, and penance manuals called penitentials laid out specific punishments for specific acts, almost like a tax code with fines attached. Here's the wild part. The church didn't just regulate what kind of sex was allowed, it regulated when. Long lists of forbidden days required married couples to abstain entirely: no sex on major holy days like Christmas or Easter, no sex during the 46 days of Lent, no sex on Sundays, no sex on fish fasting days. Add it up, and depending on which theologian you asked, couples were theoretically permitted to have sex on as little as half the days of the year. Whether anyone actually followed this calendar is another question. This obsession with control didn't come purely from Christianity itself. Stoic philosophers had already praised restraint and viewed even marital pleasure with suspicion. Jewish purity laws contributed ideas about ritual cleanliness, and early Christian thought, shaped by Gnostic influence, treated the body itself as something lesser. Mix it together and you get a framework where sex is, at best, a necessary evil, tolerated mainly because St. Paul admitted marriage was a reasonable outlet for people who couldn't manage lifelong celibacy. Some church fathers were remarkably blunt about ranking sexuality on a scale. One famous formulation held that married people earned a modest heavenly reward, chaste widows earned more, and lifelong virgins earned the greatest reward of all. Marriage was the consolation prize for people who couldn't resist their own bodies. Most people assume medieval Christianity treated all sexual pleasure as evil, full stop. The reality is more nuanced. Respected theologians, including the famously scandalous philosopher Peter Abelard, argued that pleasure within marriage wasn't just tolerated, it could be a genuine expression of the bond between spouses. Some even compared marriage to the union between Christ and the Church, framing intimacy as an echo of divine love. Sermons encouraged couples to build relationships on mutual respect and even affection, not just obligation. But theory and practice were different animals. Plenty of marriages were arranged for land, money, or political alliance, with bride and groom meeting for the first time at the altar. Love, when it existed, often grew after the wedding rather than before it. For unmarried people, the rules tightened. Sex outside marriage was labeled fornication, and the seriousness of the sin depended heavily on circumstances. A poor servant girl seduced by a nobleman faced consequences wildly different from the nobleman himself. Pregnancy outside marriage could bring real legal and social punishment, and court records are full of cases showing exactly this kind of imbalance. Women bore the heavier burden under medieval sexual law, which was written almost entirely by celibate male clergy. A woman was expected to stay a virgin until marriage, and entire categories of impurity were attached to her body. Menstruation, pregnancy, the weeks after childbirth, and breastfeeding were all periods when sex was considered forbidden. Unmarried women traditionally wore their hair loose and uncovered, a public signal that they were available for marriage, a small but telling detail about how openly a woman's status was displayed. Here's where it gets genuinely surprising. Despite the church's strict stance, brothels operated openly in most medieval cities, often with quiet tolerance from local authorities. The logic traces back to St. Augustine, who argued that eliminating prostitution entirely would simply unleash uncontrolled lust onto the rest of society. Better to channel male desire into a contained outlet than risk it spilling onto respectable married women. Prostitution became a necessary evil, condemned in theory, permitted in practice. This created a strange moral hierarchy. A number of theologians considered visiting a sex worker less sinful than masturbation, because intercourse at least carried the theoretical possibility of procreation, while masturbation offered no such excuse. In a worldview obsessed with reproduction, pleasure with zero reproductive chance was treated as uniquely pointless. Medieval people had almost none of the privacy we take for granted. Most households were small, single-room spaces shared by parents, children, relatives, and sometimes farm animals. Finding a quiet moment for intimacy was a real challenge. Historians note, half-jokingly, that an empty church or deserted cemetery may have offered couples more privacy than their own homes. This is also why so much of what we know about medieval sex comes from court records and confession manuals rather than diaries. People didn't write detailed accounts of their intimate lives. We know what we know largely because someone got caught, complained, or ended up in front of a judge. Marriage was, in theory, permanent. There was no casual divorce. But one narrow legal escape hatch involved proving impotence in court. If a couple failed to consummate their marriage, a spouse could petition for annulment, but generally had to show they genuinely tried and failed for a minimum of 3 years, sometimes with witnesses called to testify. Medieval courts occasionally heard formal testimony about a couple's failed attempts at consummation, a level of public scrutiny over private failure that's hard to imagine today. The other recognized path to annulment was proving the marriage had never been legitimate, for instance discovering the couple was too closely related by blood. Attitudes towards same-sex relationships were harsh, though they varied by region. The Church classified any non-procreative act as sodomy, a serious sin and, in many places, a serious crime. Because it was criminalized, most of what historians know comes from legal prosecutions rather than personal testimony, which skews the record heavily toward conflict and punishment. These accusations were sometimes weaponized for reasons that had little to do with actual behavior. The dramatic downfall of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century, for instance, involved accusations of unnatural acts that historians largely view as politically motivated, a reminder that morality charges in this era could double as convenient tools of persecution. Not everything was grim regulation. This period also produced courtly love, an elaborate, stylized cultural ideal of romantic devotion spread through poetry and song, especially among the nobility. It idealized passionate, often unconsummated longing, typically a knight pining for a noblewoman already married to someone else. It was less a real-world practice and more an aspirational performance of devotion and chivalry. This created a fascinating cultural split. On one side, the Church's austere, procreation-focused rulebook. On the other, poets composing breathless verses about aching hearts. Real medieval relationships rarely matched the polished perfection of courtly poetry, but the genre reveals what people found emotionally compelling, even if their actual marriages looked nothing like it. Toward the later medieval period, syphilis arrived in Europe and spread with alarming speed. Its rapid spread inadvertently revealed just how much sexual activity, inside and outside marriage, was actually happening, despite all the Church's warnings. Because medical knowledge was so limited, disease was often interpreted as divine punishment for sin. One striking 14th century account describes a young man who, after visiting a brothel, developed a severe disfiguring illness. Terrified, believing it was God's judgment, he abandoned his old life, took a vow of celibacy, and became a priest. Stories like this likely weren't unique. They reflect a broader pattern of fear-driven religious conversion tied to sexual guilt. So what's the real takeaway? Medieval attitudes towards sex were a genuine tangle of contradictions. The Church preached strict rules focused on procreation within marriage, while tolerating brothels as a necessary evil. Theologians debated whether marital pleasure was acceptable, while ranking sexual sins on an oddly specific scale. Poets wrote about romantic longing while most real marriages were arranged for property and politics, and ordinary people, lacking even basic privacy, found ways to live their intimate lives in the cracks between all these competing pressures. The biggest myth about medieval sex isn't that people did strange things, it's the idea that everyone simply obeyed the rulebook from the pulpit. In reality, medieval Europe looked like every other era of human history. Official doctrine on one side, lived behavior quietly diverging from it on the other, with court records and the occasional impotence trial left behind as proof of just how wide that gap really was. If this deep dive into medieval intimacy surprised you, let me know in the comments which fact shocked you most: the Forbidden Day calendar, the brothel paradox, or the public impotence trials. And if you want more myth-busting deep dives into history's most misunderstood eras, hit subscribe. See you in the next one.